Okay, let's just get started. As I said there, welcome to you all. Welcome to this latest webinar that we, the elders, are putting on. And I can see one or two faces from before, some new people. So, but welcome to you all. The title of this seminar is called Celebrating Your Journey and the Future That Awaits. We all know the feeling of there's just so much more to do. I'm sure you all know that feeling. And of course, we always have a song associated with each of our webinars, as you know. So this one says, "I'm Still Standing" by Elton John, which we thought was very apt. Just some kind of housekeeping. As you'll all be used to these webinars these days, if you could stay on mute, that would be fantastic. We're keen to hear what your thoughts are. So there's a chat there, so just add anything in the chat. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel, website, and by our partners. So if you'd rather not be seen, please turn off your camera and mute the microphone. So standard sort of procedure. I should also mention at this point that the next webinar is on the 11th of April. What if my successor doesn't work out? What can I learn? So that's another topical issue, I suspect, for many of us. But let's press on with today's webinars, and I'd like to hand over now to Chris, who's going to introduce the topic and the speakers. Over to you, Chris.
Great, thank you. A very warm welcome to everyone. Lovely to see old friends and new here, very welcome indeed. I wanted to invite the first speaker to come straight on. Taffy, are you good to go with us?
Sure.
Great, welcome. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, so thank you for that. I'm not entirely sure that I'm comfortable with being called an elder, but I'll leave you to judge at the end of all of this. The kind of discussion that I had with you in particular, Chris, was to say, well, explore this through your own journey and see where it takes you. So the main things that I'd want to note in my own journey is that it's really been a privilege because I've managed to work right through an entire spectrum of society, particularly in South Africa, but also in other areas. I started my life, or my active life, as a student activist way back in the 1970s, and even a little bit earlier. So there's kind of, 45 to 50 years of activism going there. I then became a trade union activist an organizer in the bad old days of apartheid, when we were again dealing with a mainly black union at a time when unions were not illegal, but were unlawful, and there's a distinction. I then kind of tried to become an academic and failed at that, so I'm a kind of lapsed academic. And then got involved in what I think people in the UK or Europe anyway would mainly know as social housing, and I helped to build what was probably one of the first post-apartheid social housing institutions. I moved from there to become part of government. So I helped set up a national parastatal dealing again with land and housing. And then moved from there after a 5-year stint. I was 15 years in the social housing environment. After a 5-year stint, I moved into kind of call it the private, both for-profit and not-for-profit sector. And that was also a massive extension of one's exposure, because you're then moving into kind of big business and the way in which big business in particular and the private sector operates. So I've got that kind of overall view of the world. And in addition to that, I've been involved in a number of charitable organizations. I'm chair of a couple of charitable trusts. I've been involved in financial services, development financial institutions. And at the moment, I'm working mainly with the local university, the University of the Witwatersrand, dealing with one of their big property disposals, really, disposal made by Alfred Beit, who was a landlord, a big mining magnate, and it's 100 years since we've had that property, and as well as the kind of urban management environment in the suburbs around which Wits operates. And I also am a director of a number of listed companies. So as I say, it's this kind of broad spectrum that I've been really privileged to be party to. And in thinking about celebrating the journey, I thought what I'd do is to try and look at what were some of the kind of guiding lessons and principles that came out of that journey. I think one of the first things was that I certainly would still profess to be a Marxist, and that's a distinction about an analytical framework as opposed to a political allegiance. But it's just working on this assumption that men make their own history, but they don't, and obviously men and women in the generic sense is a quote from Marx, but they don't make it as they please. So being very mindful of what's possible and what's not possible in the environment within which you work. And that, I think, requires an understanding of context. So context matters. I think that the other issue that one tries to learn about is emotions, and emotions matter. So you've got to be very aware of your emotions, and you've got to be aware of them both in terms of how you deal with them and how you play them. I often tell people that I try to play chess in that kind of environment, so that you can turn on the anger when it needs to be turned on, and you can turn it off when it doesn't. But you do that as a conscious activity, as a conscious action. And that worked very well, particularly when I was in the trade union movement, because I knew that I was getting them angry and that I wasn't angry at the same point. So the kind of the body language and the language, the emotional language is very important in that kind of environment. And as far as kind of emotional understanding goes, things like anger gets us into trouble, but pride keeps us there. And so this issue of individual pride is, I think, a very important issue to understand. In many of the organizations that I've worked with, hubris was not the important issue. It wasn't really the thing that you were there for, but you need to understand that other people were involved in hubristic activity. But I think that one of the success lines in what I was doing, one of the issues of failure or not, had to do with whether people were in it for their own good or people were in it for the general good. And you had to make that kind of distinction and be able to perceive that, because sometimes what people said they were doing was not exactly what they did doing. I also came to understand that values and relationships trump most things. And so one's got to kind of put those above everything. Don't go into an organization where you don't think you can trust the people who are your colleagues and fellows. And that there is a need at times to kind of just take a deep breath and make the decision. You can't keep on weighing things up. Again, my mentors would often say to me that I did that too often. And there were some big mistakes that I made in trying to think too deeply. You kind of make the decision, you push it through, and you deal with the consequences. And in not doing that, there were some very serious consequences. I think another important lesson was to understand that change and development are incremental and are dependent on context. So it's great to have big plans, and it's important to have big plans. Absolutely no doubt about that. But again, in my experience, and in some situations, I've been in organizations that have taken 15 years to develop. It's very important to understand that in moving the dial, things move sometimes slowly, and then when you look back, you see that today is better than yesterday. And again, that's an important thing to understand and not to get frustrated about. And one of the things I always used to say to people that I worked with, one of the quotes that I used quite often, was the following: success is nothing more than a few simple disciplines practiced every day, while failure is simply a few errors and judgments repeated every day. It's the accumulated weight of our disciplines and our judgments that leads us to either fortune or failure. So again, very important to kind of bring people along with you in that situation. Perhaps
about 3 minutes, Taffy, about 3 minutes to go.
Okay. Another vital important issue was to understand that not-for-profit, which is the kind of environment that I was in, also means not for loss. And one of the major issues is that you work on this understanding that you're not a not-for-profit, but you've got to understand where your losses and where the cost covering is going to be. And then two last points in this area is that you've just got to make sure the glue. You've just got to make sure that whatever is in the organization, and I'm talking about the secretarial services, I'm talking about who gets the computers, very important, because to just work at the top is, I think, detrimental. So where do we go from here? Where do I go from here? And in the kind of rubric of there's so much more to do. And that's true. But I think in my life anyway, I'm going to look to go where I'm wanted. I don't want to get into, I know that I'm needed in many situations, needed in that sense, but I don't think it's worth trying to force your way into environments. So don't get into a situation where you'd be frustrated by not being consulted, number one, by not being trusted, number two, and recognize the strengths and weaknesses of your changing status, because your status is changing. You are becoming an elder, and you've got to come to terms with that and so fit yourself into the plans and developments of those who are now taking up the cudgels that you might have had. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Taffy, very much indeed, and beautifully timed, if I may say. That's absolutely marvelous. Thank you very much indeed for that very helpful and significant homily, which we'll take on board in questions after we have heard our next two speakers. The next speaker is Andrea Coleman, who is no stranger to any of the folk who have been members for a while and who know us. Andrea is a co-founder of the Elders, the Council for Social Entrepreneurs, and of course is a social entrepreneur in her own right. Andrea, you're most welcome. Do please unmute.
Rookie error. First out of the traps, got that wrong. Hi everyone, so nice to see you all. Yeah, I must say, Taffy, just in response to what you're saying about being an elder, I think what our job here is to undermine the idea of elder meaning just an elderly or older person. This is about the wisdom and experience that we can share with the community. So thank you for all your wisdom and experience. 35 years ago, I founded an organization focused on transport, the management of transport for the delivery of healthcare in rural Africa. And it's a tricky issue to take on because nobody's really that interested in transport except me and our group. We're passionately interested in it, but it's been a bit of an uphill struggle. But right from the start, we wanted to make sure that it was Africa-led. And in the first instance, we made sure that each of the programs was run and managed by nationals of the countries in which we were operating. Each of those countries has always had its own African leadership, African workforce, and that really has been to do with training and putting in place all the things that mean we can give the support to those leaders. And then 5 or 6 years ago, I had a really difficult transition. I'd been planning it for a long time, but it really didn't work very well. And I certainly have things that I'd love to hear from other people on our next webinar about when the successor doesn't work. But then we realized that where I'd been making my big mistake was to try and think about how to get leadership in the UK to support all the programs in Africa. And of course, how silly was that? Because we realized then that the most important thing was to have African leadership at the top of Riders for Health. And so that for me has always been that if you have the leadership in the countries in which the organization is operating, it becomes deeply rooted. It has the ownership of the people of that country, and also they're very clear about how to navigate with the ministries of health and with local partners and so on. It makes no sense to do that operating from overseas, from my perspective. So my job was to help think about how do we make sure that we give appropriate support to African leadership leading that, leading the whole movement. But for me not to back away and not give support to that. So I set up another organization called Two Wheels for Life that is focused only on advocacy and fundraising, and that work supports the teams in Africa and the new African leadership. That organization is now run and managed by a man called Kayode Ajayi from Nigeria, supported by a woman called Mahadi Hlasa, who I think some of you have met on this webinar, on one of our webinars. So I think that in looking at succession for me, I didn't look very carefully at what that meant for me personally. I thought about the organization and the culture that I would like to see developed, but I didn't really think about myself. So I think that I was very fortunate because I was able to be part of the wellbeing program, which has been really spread its awareness through the social enterprise community to help us all be able to manage our own well-being. But then I think that Mary, who's with us here, has had some similar sort of struggles. How do you make sure that you continue the work that you have started, that is still burning in your blood in the same way as it was on day one? How do you look after yourself, and how do you also help to support a community when you've learned a lot of lessons yourself and help to pass them on to other people? So to support the work, as I say, I set up Two Wheels for Life to support the community. I've been so lucky to work with Mel and Chris and with all of you on building the Elders Council for Social Entrepreneurship, to look at ways of learning from others, both others' successes and others' mistakes, particularly around transitions and succession, and how you manage emotionally, how you manage practically, how you manage the money, and all those sort of things. And I've also set up an alliance, transport and mobility alliance with a colleague at World Bicycle Relief to move forward the mission of transport for rural Africa. And I think why that is important is not to leave your mission behind, but once you don't have the burden of running the organization day to day, you can really think about the issue area and really broaden it out and take that forward. So I don't think I've done terribly well in figuring out how to manage myself as I get older. I just like to be useful, but also I hate the idea of not being relevant and being part of a community. So I've still got a long journey to take, but I feel that I can be helpful in supporting other people, and I know that being able to think about moving your issue area forward, for me, is a great blessing and it's such a great thrill to see the teams in Africa take their work forward themselves and do it the way they believe it needs to be done. So I think that's where I am at the moment. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Andrea, very much indeed. Something that you and Taffy have held in common is this wish to be useful as you proceed, and to go to somewhere, as it were, somewhere in quotes, where you will find an effectiveness or a usefulness, and that's certainly helpful. And thank you, Taffy, for putting that quote up on the chat. Very helpful, and others may want to look at it as we go along. That's great. Gretchen, let's invite you to come in now, and you're most welcome. It's lovely to have you here at the Elders Council, and thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so early in my own stage of transition that I feel like I really should be listening in here as opposed to sharing, but I'm grateful for the opportunity, and much of what both Taffy and Andrea just said resonates as well with my own journey. A quick background, and then would love to draw upon some of these common learnings, common threads. 17 years ago, I founded an organization called Global Grassroots, which works with women survivors of war in East Africa, Rwanda and Uganda primarily, and girls even broader throughout the region. And our program involves a mindfulness-based leadership program and a social venture incubator to help them advance their own ideas for their own local communities. And I started this work very humbly already, sort of coming in one direction and realizing I knew nothing, and shifting my perspective and programs really through listening deeply to the local population. And it was always a commitment of ours to honor and respect and support as partners local African wisdom, local African leadership, especially among women, and local African solutions, as opposed to sort of imposing from the top down that we see very often in international development. And I guess I will soon be a serial entrepreneur as I have other ideas and other things to create, and had always intended to begin my transition, and through a number of missteps, had to keep coming back to spearhead and lead things. And I think the biggest mistake was thinking that succession meant finding someone who was just another person like myself, to move things to the next level or just to take over. And when that wasn't working, we all sat down as an organization and did a very, very deep dive into our values to really understand who we were and were we embodying them at the deepest level. And of course we weren't, because our commitment to African leadership was not reflected in our board or in our executive committee, which was all led by Americans. And so I made the commitment to move us into a place of complete African leadership on all fronts. And I also, because I've always honored this participatory bottom-up process, didn't want that to be another imposed perspective of what we should look like. And so we worked really hard with some external support to make sure we were using a more, what they call liberatory power dynamics, in going through this process of co-designing as an entire organization what that might look like. And what came out on the other end was, it took us a little over a year and a half, a majority African-led female board, all of our programs, operations, and systems and staffing being a majority African, with, sort of like Andrea did, what we call in the US, a Friends of organization. We wanted to be a Friends Plus organization where we were dedicated to advocacy and fundraising, such that everything else was led and run by our staff in East Africa. And we tripled our staff there and took everyone in the US down to one single person. And that felt, it was fast. It's been scary. I think I resonate with a lot of what Taffy said about around context matters, relationships matter, values matter. And that was what drove all of the choices that we made in moving in this direction. But you can't always maintain control over those outcomes. I hope I won't be here at the next session on when your successor doesn't work out. I think we've done a great job of I think the biggest area that we needed to put a lot of care into was ensuring we all embraced the culture that we wanted to emerge on the other end as essential to who we were, to our special sauce, to our sense of each other, to our family and our relationships. And I think even bringing anyone in new, that there is a transition process there. And so we, and then I think what I've heard from others in this conversation is that the people and the values and that trust that you build is what holds that process. That is the container for any transition to move through. That shared mission, that commitment is what has allowed us to go through, and myself, that process of being able to let go and trust and allow whatever wants to emerge now to be what that new organization is. And so I, coming back to some of the common threads that I see here and through my own experience, there's one that you both mentioned, sort of the management of emotions and our own self-care. And that is pretty critical to our work. We are so good as social entrepreneurs at forgetting ourselves in the process, sort of sacrificing for the cause. And without being able to be self-aware and be grounded, we come into these relationships and problem solving from a fix-it mindset and a greater level of rigidity and attachment to thinking we know the right answer, and being able to pause, see how it's affecting us, and be able to attend to that without it kind of bleeding out into the rest of the organization is really pretty critical. And that's a core component of our work, doing mindfulness work as well, is that that emotional and self-awareness really serves us in the ways in which we connect with others, and Taffy, to be strategic in using those emotions when you need to be. And what you said about systems and people, not just leading from the top, that obviously has been a core value of all of ours in terms of ensuring an organization's sustainability and success. So I loved, Andrea, the way in which you framed supporting of the organization, supporting of the mission or the work more broadly, and supporting of self. Obviously, supporting of self is the critical foundation. Supporting the organization, we did the same in creating that support system and infrastructure to ensure that it thrives without the burdens that they didn't want. And then supporting the work. And that's what I think is so wonderful about these moments of transition, is that we get to move into these spaces of sharing greater wisdom, sharing and applying our lessons in other places and in other ways. Perhaps I'll have the opportunity, like Taffy, to work across so many different perspectives within a single industry, that wisdom just really cuts across and can really be of greater service. But knowing that we shift our relationship to the organization, but we don't have to give up our passion for the work, and that we can find new ways of taking what we have learned and making it available for the sake of that issue and that cause. So that's sort of my story and what resonates with me from your journeys as well.
Thank you so much, Gretchen. That was very helpful, and thank you for blending your own circumstances with those of our two other speakers. That's been really helpful. So it'd be lovely to hear from others in the group now. We've had three wonderful, short, succinct presentations, which for which I am very grateful for, the succinctness and the quality of them. And it's now really a question of inviting the rest of the participants here to come in and make your contribution and ask questions or just give your thoughts. Who would like to start, or would you like me to invite you to start? Who would like to come in? Sue, you and I haven't seen each other for many years, and it's lovely to see you now. Would you like to comment upon what you've heard? Would that be a useful thing to do?
I think I'm just at the stage of just absorbing. I mean, as a first time here.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see you after so many years.
Yes, and yeah, I feel it sounds as though the speakers are much more sort of currently engaged than I am at the moment. But things that have gone around in my own head, I suppose, that I've not really heard discussed in a forum before. So that's quite interesting.
Yes, I think that's one of the reasons why why Andrea and Mel and others, but Andrea, Mel and I in particular, felt it was important to bring this together. So that's great. Pushpanath, welcome. You're on mute at the moment, Push.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, you're most welcome. And here you are. You have just done your amazing walk all the way up the spine of England into Scotland for the COP. And here you are listening to these three speakers. What are your reflections?
I think I'm more like soaking in those wonderful, precise way of saying Taffy is such an enormous amount of time and doing so many things, but how I'm learning how to be precise with all this learning to say, and that has been so was the other speakers as well, like Andrea, and I don't know. I was just writing 2 or 3 things. One is that having been living in countries and in each country doing stuff was for me a process of self-discovery. And that has actually helped. Who am I and why am I here kind of thing. And also including taking a break and going back to India and living there for 10 years after traveling across the world. And that was another interesting way, gave me a perspective. The other point is that a lot of pressure on me to set up organizations and so on. Right from day one, I decided I will not do that, because I think there are enough and more in some time in the graveyard or in the cemetery of ideas which have died. So I didn't feel like I want to be one of that. And that actually helped me to make decisions, to understand, as they said, that wherever I was is to understand the context that is going on there as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and try to identify being, as you called, a friend. I think that is a very useful word. I like, and define yourself what friendship means, and then play a kind of complementary role and cooperative role and a co-traveler role, so that you can actually move on until friends are asked for. And I think in that context, I think I said I have shared with you, which I can share again. When I went back to India, I wanted to look at Bangalore being one of the richest cities in the shortest possible time. I wanted to know what does that kind of wealth creation meant in the city. How does that impact people who are actually living in the margin? And that resulted in this study, which is called Made in Bangalore. Looking at all the change makers and how each one of them, and then actually capturing that story from a lens of all the things you're talking about, from mobility, housing, from education, health. These are the key areas in which people living in poverty get impacted. So that was a very powerful experience, and learning myself as well as putting this something in the hands of all those entrepreneurs. So it was possible to kind of them come to create a platform. So I don't have to worry whether it's continuing, whether I'm there or not. In each of the work that I've been involved, whether it is fair trade down in India or the social enterprise, or continuing to mentor and support other people when they ask for me. So those are the kind of quick thoughts. I'm sorry to be rambling. But
it's okay, Push. That's fine. That's very interesting to hear your views, particularly those of being an influencer, which I think extremely important, especially as we move into eldership. That's an important feature, I think. Bradley, welcome.
Thank you.
Did you want to make a comment? You're one of our frequent visitors, and it would be nice to hear from you.
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciate these sessions, and thank you to Chris and Andrea and Mel for organizing this. I think the one comment that I was reflecting on that Andrea touched on and Gretchen touched on as well was this idea of when you step outside the role of being a leader of an individual organization, it frees you up to potentially have more of an issue-wide impact or a field-wide impact. Andrea, the point you made about the Mobility Alliance that you set up, my own reflection is that I worked on the issue of human trafficking for 20 years as the CEO of an organization for 10 of them at an organization called Polaris. And I often, in the later years of being in that role, began to feel that being so affiliated with one organization was preventing that field-wide work. Because wherever you go, any person you're talking to or donor you're talking to, they're seeing you as like, oh, well, you're the CEO of that one organization. So clearly you're thinking about that one organization. And I'd be like, well, no, I'm trying to think about, that happens to be my job, but I'm thinking about the field as a whole. And sometimes maybe the perch of being the CEO of a single organization doesn't free you up to do that field-wide leadership. Maybe sometimes it does. So in just my own sliver of one experience, I found that not being in the CEO role then frees you up to kind of be more of an honest broker with governments and with donors and with others. People kind of listen to you differently. But I've talked to others who, while being in that CEO role, didn't find it to be constraining, and they were able to have that field-wide impact. So I guess that's been a question that I've been mulling over of, is field-wide, issue-wide impact kind of congruent with single organization CEO leadership, or somehow the two can't go hand in hand? And certainly at this kind of mid-career stage for me, I don't have a good answer for that, but I'd be curious what kind of others in the room have been thinking, and if others were reflecting on those themes from Andrea and Gretchen.
Gretchen, where are you in that now? Where are you in that thought process?
Yeah, I'm moving into a space where I wanted to move beyond my work in just East Africa, which felt like the space at which so many of my ideas were developed and prototyped and tested, to be able to support a broader global movement, new applications of that approach, connecting and being part of the connective tissue between different networks and communities. So I'm very much in that space of wanting to be more involved. And I think I'm finding two things. One, definitely freed up. I mean, I've been wanting to work in the thought leadership, movement building space for a while, but was constrained by the focus on the day-to-day operations and the strategies of the single organization. But it is also sometimes limiting to not, I think when the organization itself has such a strong standing in a particular field, to not be the representative of that does make it harder to open certain doors, and just being a sort of a solo agent. And I think it matters how you deliver your own thought leadership and your own thinking and involvement in this space. And, collaboration is really critical, and obviously on so many fronts, it's essential to being able to achieve long-lasting impact. So that's where I'm focused now, is a number of different collaborative endeavors.
I feel as though it might be helpful at some point for those of us who are thinking about how to broaden our influence area to come up with some examples of how that might be done, because we can't be the only ones who are wanting to do that. So I just feel as though, as Gretchen and Bradley have said on behalf of everyone, that maybe some examples of that, because in a way, in some senses, I personally feel it's almost like starting a new, it's almost like going back to the beginning, because it's different from starting your own organization that's focused on changing particular systems. This is about mind changing on your issue area. So I just wonder if that's something we could collaborate on, all of us.
I wonder if it's a really fascinating conversation. I wonder if I could just ask Taffy, because in the webinars we've had, and indeed in this one, you know, we're talking about social entrepreneurs who are remaining social entrepreneurs, remaining in the sector, if you like, possibly starting other organizations or growing organizations. But in a sense, you're quite unique, because you've been, as you described, in these different sectors. You came out, there was a trade union movement, you were in the voluntary sector, the private sector, working with government. Is that something, I mean, have you obviously learned a lot on the way, and you're obviously very committed to the impact you're making? Do you think all of us need to kind of have these experiences in different sectors in order, as we get a bit older, to become more impactful? Is that your feeling, or actually, is it the other way? We need to kind of stay in our own sector and concentrate on what we're doing, or is it a bit of both? But I'd be really interested to hear your insight, Taffy, on that.
So let me make a couple of comments. Firstly, let me just respond to Bradley's question and comment. I think context matters very much in that kind of situation. When I was the CEO of the Johannesburg Housing Company, and there was a need to create a sector-wide body, an umbrella body, it was incredibly important. Being the CEO was very important, because it gave you status, it gave you resources, it gave you the ability to, in a sense, be a mover and shaker in that environment, which you might not have had if you were not in that position. So in that particular situation, context matters. In a situation that I'm currently involved in, and there's a need to support, there's a need for a bigger activity in a university context. The opportunity has arisen because of a new CEO in a particular division. And essentially then we've been very open and discussing about it. I've been very happy to discuss the idea of being second fiddle, but supporting the first fiddle. And my kind of words to him were, I'm a good second fiddle, and I will work with you to create the kind of strategic environment and the structural environment that you think are important. So that all I'm saying is that it changes depending on where you're at this point in time. I think, to go to your question, Mel, essentially, I was able to move into bigger and bigger environments. The Development Finance Institution that we started in 1994 started with a capital base of 6 million rand, and it's now built itself up to a situation where it now has funded sort of 30,000 housing units and has a book of 4 billion rand. But that couldn't be done. I mean, and there you basically were working with on the directors. We were part of a group that started this thing and basically got others to be involved. I mean, I've been massively impacted. I mean, I come out of a sort of certainly a left-wing environment. I mean, my uncle was the secretary of the South African Communist Party, you know, that kind of environment. But to understand the power of capital, it was really a revelation to me. I mean, it took us 15 years to build up the Johannesburg Housing Company to 3,000 units and a capital value of 1 billion rand. It took us a year in a listed company to build up to 10,000 units and a capital value of 4 billion rand. So I think that, and again, the canvas in South Africa moved dramatically. So it's all about context. I mean, when we started in the 1970s and 1980s, you were really able to move mountains. I mean, a strike in that environment had a massive impact. Today, people strike all the time. And it doesn't have the same kind of impact. But certainly the ability to get that perspective. I mean, I think my ability to, sorry, I'm going on now, but my ability to consider things at scale was massively enhanced by moving into, in particular, government and into medium-sized business. I mean, we're kind of small fry in the biggest scheme of things. But, you know, small fry means still being relatively large. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm certainly pleased to have been able to move into that kind of context over time.
So I think that's helpful. Thank you, Taffy, for that. Thanks, Mel. And I think the whole question of context is becoming increasingly important in this conversation. I don't know whether that helped Bradley to at least resolve the conversation for the moment from your perspective. Yeah. Ingrid, are you with us at the moment?
I am. Yes, I finished eating.
Well done. You're at a different stage, I think, to some of the other speakers. Tell us where you are at the moment in terms of the stages that you're at and where you're, and I think you're at the sort of first stage in the sense that you're thinking of moving on in a year or two. Is that right?
No, a lot more than a year or two. I mean, I'm thinking very much longer term than a year or two, but probably more like 5 or 10. But I think my main interest really is ensuring that we can plan for the practical and the emotional changes. We do a lot of work. We work in education. We do a lot of work on supporting kids to transition between schools. And the more we've been doing on that recently, the more I've been thinking we need to, do this ourselves. We need to plan our own transitions better. So we've got a really fantastic team around the world. There are people emerging who I look at them and I think, oh, one day you're going to run ENET one day, or you're going to lead it, or you're going to have a significant role in it. And I want to be thinking about how we plan for that, how we keep them interested and motivated to want to do that, how we prepare them for it. And generally, so that there's never when I leave the organization, almost nobody notices I've gone because we've got such a strong alternative, solution to the leadership already in place. But that would be my ideal. And we already have that in many ways. We've already got a lot of very strong people around the world who are doing their task. I won't try and explain how we operate. It'll take too long. But I just want to make sure that we've got a good plan in place, so there's no shocks, there's no upsets, there's no resentments, there's no fears, there's nothing going on. It's a slow and gradual changeover. That's my thinking. That's where I'm going. But I'm obviously wanting to see how other people are doing it and how we can make that happen, and whether it's possible for that to happen. But
absolutely. Well, you've come to the right place, and you're most welcome. Yeah, absolutely. Alfred, I saw that you had your hand up there. Thank you, Ingrid. Alfred, did you want to make a comment?
First of all, I'm sorry I came late. I'm in Melbourne, and I found it difficult to wake up at 3 in the morning.
I can imagine. Well, you're very welcome.
Thank you. So I missed the first 3 presentations, but I just want to mention the reason I've joined you is that I'm an elder. I've worked overseas as a public health doctor in about 30 different countries around the world, in all the continents, based in UK, Africa, India, and the US. Came back to Australia. And I've just started a business called Sing with Fred to get elders to sing more to each other, because there's not enough song to communicate between elders. And I just wanted to mention that to you in case anyone was interested. And I lived in Mysore, actually, and I had family in Bangalore in the 60s, and now they're living in Mangalore. And I've also got family in the US. But I just want to mention about being an elder, and I keep telling people, number one is when you're an elder, you're in a new situation because you can get away with just about anything, because whatever you say or do, they'll say, oh, he's just old. So, so you can have a lot of fun. The other things I mentioned to people that I've gone through is writing an ebook as a legacy, which I think is very important for everyone, and they should start early. The second thing is work out your core values. You can Google it. I found out my core values are actually humor, curiosity, and innovation. And I always thought I was a stand-up comedian. So,
well, at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're doing well
with people. So life is meant to be fun. The other big thing is about resolving my issues with my immediate family. And I'm talking to my mother, who died 30 years ago, and I made a video called Conversations with My Mother. And I eventually found out through a nice mentor that what she wanted was gratitude. And I think people want to be recognized. They want to be recognized as individuals. And I think that was why I got round with Sing with Fred. Anyway, I want to mention those things. And
thank you,
I want to congratulate you, and I'd like to communicate with you more in the future.
You're most welcome, and thank you very much for that. And thank you for rising early in the morning.
Okay.
I can see you've got a lovely beach behind you, although I don't think
that's just manufactured.
That's right.
Yeah, that's all.
I was hoping for the best. Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Gretchen, you put an important remark on the chat there. Do you want to just quickly expound it before we come to an end? We're just about to invite Mel to come back in and do a quick summary.
Well, there was a question about I put 2 different components there. One was about how to move into the thought leadership space, at least sort of how I've been involved in it, and the other about how some of our staff, especially in the US, managed or kind of took on this shift themselves, because I think we had we went from a complete swap where 2/3 of the budget was in the US and 1/3 in Africa, and we swapped it and tripled staff and had the majority of folks step down. And it was really because we went through a co-design process around our core values and how we were embodying them, and our commitment to our shared mission. And everyone was really on board and saw that transition as an indicator of our success. And so the process of going through this was careful and intentional, and really took into account care for everybody's future. But we shifted trend in a way that was incredibly collaborative. And as a result, we still call ourselves a family that has an extended family outside of those who are like actually employed in the organization, and a network of champions now. So
that's great. So I'm just about, thank you so much, Gretchen. I'm just about to pass to you, Mel, for a bit of a summary, but I wanted just to say how much we really enjoyed having not only the speakers here with us today, but also the participants. Thank you all of you who have spoken, and very much appreciate the attendance of others who haven't had a chance to speak on this occasion. Mary, wonderful that you could be with us, and thank you, Ralph, for coming and joining us again. You are one of our founding elders, so that's absolutely great. Pamela, wonderful that you could join us, and Debbie as well, Vijaya. Really appreciate you coming to be with us, and hope you all join us again. And do join us in terms of becoming either an associate or an elder. Just go onto the website and you'll see. Mel, may I come back to you?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So it falls on me to sum up, which is always impossible. An hour flies by so fast, and there's such rich input, fantastic input from our three speakers, incredibly grateful, and everybody else in the chat who spoke. I think maybe just as 2 or 3 points that I could probably take away, which was mentioned quite often actually by the three speakers and in some of the chat, really was about the key area of emotions and values and relationships. As we go through our journey, it's about fostering a culture which is based on basic values, human values. And as we transition out of organizations, that the culture and those values are left behind. And that's very, very important. Another one that emerged connected to that actually was that the need to look after ourselves. So maybe Alfred's point there at the end about enjoying life and having a bit of fun and singing together, it is actually very important that we actually look after ourselves. And I think, you know, from past webinars and indeed this one, there's plenty of evidence to show that we're not so good at looking after ourselves because actually we're much more concentrated on the outcomes. That's what's driving us. So that's very, very important point that emerged out of this, I think. Management of our emotions and so on. And also other comments that I picked up about, you know, it's important for us to remain relevant as we move on. Because we're concerned about the state of the world, that part of the question at the end is just so much more to do. That's what drives us on. And I think, you know, from Taffy's experience anyway, changing in different sectors, it's fascinating to learn, I think, that you can be very impactful in different sectors. So maybe government annoys us a lot and gets in the way, but actually sometimes it can be an enabler to get to the vision that we might want to have. So moving into other sectors as we move on in our journey might be something we want to consider a bit more. And it's also about critically, and I know there's a lot of talk about it at the moment, about changing systems. So we are part of something that creates system change, to change the culture, that creates an impact that then changes the world. So that's really my headline takeaways out of this. Once again, a really constructive, positive contribution, and one I'm sure, once again, that could go on for a lot longer, and one that I could take to run out of the conclusions for about 20 minutes. So I've tried to do a couple of takeaways in 2 minutes. But suffice to say, it's very, very constructive. Great to see everybody. Thank you all so much for joining. Don't forget, you can, if you're not a member, you can join up online. And our next webinar, as I said, on the 11th of April, and we'd love to see you all there. Maybe the issue isn't quite so relevant to you, but just being part here, being part of this family, being part of this group, and talking about issues that are really relevant to us, genuinely relevant to us. It's important. So we really look forward to seeing you. Stay in touch in the meantime. And thank you all very much again. And we'll see you all soon. Thank you. Thanks to the speakers. Fantastic.
Many thanks. Thank you, Taffy. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you
Lovely
very much.
to see you.
Thank you.
Don't forget to let us
Cheers.
know what you think's relevant. Bye.
Thank you,
Cheers.
Agnes.